Well, we also like to begin with a blessing. Angel, would you do that, please? I know I'm calling right on the spot, no preparation, but she's good. Okay.
Aloha, everybody. Hello. Welcome to Sunny Volcano. We have a different definition for sun. All right, just kind of take a deep breath, relax. We want to have a relaxing, fun time here in Sunny Volcano. Close your eyes if you like. And let's just take a deep breath. And let's thank this universe for all the wonderful things that we have in our life. Our cars, our homes, all the clothes that we have, the money that we have in our wallets, the money that we have in the bank. Let's be thankful for all our wonderful friends and the freedom that we have to go where we want to go and do what we want to do. Thank you very much, universe, for my wonderful life. I am a wonderful person. That's okay, we can give ourselves confidence. So I want you to tell yourself, I am wonderful. I am fantastic. I love myself. This is a great day, and I have a wonderful life. Thank you very much, universe, for my wonderful, wonderful life. Aloha.
Mahalo. Okay. And I just want to add, doesn't matter how much of anything you have, be thankful for it anyway. Okay? Okay, we're going to begin with a story. And this story is a story from ancient Hawaii. It's about ancient Hawaii. Ikawa kahiko, mamua loa o kapena kuke. Once upon a time, long before Captain Cook, there was a chief of part of an island, but there was a chief named Macaulay. The word means red eye. We don't know what island he was on. But he became chief of a large ahupua'a, and I'll explain that in a moment. But he became a chief when he was named as a successor by his father just before he died. So the boy tried very hard to be a good chief. Now when we say the word ahupua'a, some of you may know it, but some of you may not. This was a type of land division in ancient times. An ideal ahupua'a would include the sea out to the reefs, to the edge of the reefs. It would come inland, and it would go up into the mountains. And if it was really ideal, it would have almost a shape of a pie going up. Of course, you've seen the islands. That doesn't always work, but that would be an ideal. It almost always included the shore and the mountains as part of it. And the idea was to help make different parts of the island as self-sufficient as possible. Not completely, because of the nature of things, that didn't work. So sometimes one ahupua'a would have a family that specialized in making, let's say, tools out of stone. And the same kind of stone wasn't available in another one. And some people would have better fishing grounds. So they might trade fish for tools. So there was a lot of trade that went on between them. But as much as possible, they were designed to be self-sufficient. So that's basically what it was. Now, the ahupua'a were divided by the high chief of the whole island. Sometimes, like Big Island was so big, at different times it might have 3 high chiefs, but let's keep it ideal. One chief who's the high chief of the entire island. Okay? And in modern times, and in later days, these were called kings as well, but we'll call him a high chief. So he would, when he gained control of the island, he owned it, and he would appoint lesser chiefs to to take care of different divisions of the island. And they were responsible for everything. They were responsible for protecting the people there. They were responsible for paying the taxes, which were usually in kind, of some kind, pigs or tapa cloth, whatever was needed. And then if it was a really big ahupua'a, the chief in charge of it would appoint lesser chiefs to take care of different portions. So that's kind of how the thing worked. But there was a lot of responsibility that went to that. I mentioned the collecting of taxing. So Macaulay was responsible for the taxes to pay to the high chief. He was also responsible for being ready to provide troops and supplies in case of war. And like I said, taking care of his people. So his own chiefly compound, the Hawaiians of those ancient days did not live in villages. They lived in family compounds. Or as when the chiefs were there would be chief compounds, which was really like a big family. Okay? And his was near the sea, so he would very often go out and he would check on how the fishing was going. He'd go along to the halau wa'a, which was where the canoes were stored, and he'd see how the canoe, because the canoes had to be ready for all kinds of purposes, so he would check and see what the state of the canoes was at. Sometimes he'd go inland and he'd look at what we might as well call farms, and he'd check and see how the sweet potatoes and the bananas and the taro and all the food crops were growing. Once in a while, he'd even go way up inland, because part of his territory, and he'd see how the stone cutters, if there were any, or the feather bird catchers and the wood cutters, and see how things were going there. So he was a very conscientious chief. At home also, those were not the only things he had to take care of, because he inherited 3 young wives from his father, and he got a new wife when he became chief for political reasons. So he tried his very best to take care of them as well as he could too. Okay? Then there were the physical exercises that were necessary, because he had to be ready for war. Not him, but just him, but all his nobles that were part of his domain. So he oversaw the physical exercises, which included, spear throwing and different kinds of use of weapons and running. Running was very important, because sometimes you had to run toward the enemy and sometimes you had to run away from the enemy. So that was another part of the training. But they had to be in good physical shape. So he kept doing that too. Then there were also the religious ceremonies. And there were a lot of those. There were different orders of priests, and they each had their own temples. And sometimes the Macaulay, as chief, sometimes he had to attend, sometimes he had to participate. And he had to make sure that the temples and the shrines were all kept up, okay? Because the religion was a very, very important part in those ancient times. So when Macaulay was young, he used to, like most of the Hawaiians at that time, especially the chiefs, he used to enjoy fishing, he enjoyed surfing, he enjoyed playing games, but he somehow wasn't able to find time for that anymore. He knew his father did it, but somehow he just couldn't work it out. We'll find out why in a moment. And his advisors, for their own various reasons, their own little searchings for power, didn't help him very much. Now, some of his duties, especially in the religious ceremonies, included the drinking of ava. Now, some people know that as kava. Okay? Well, here in Hawaii, it was called ava. And this was ava was used as for religious ceremonies, as a ritual drink to honor the gods. And it was also used as something for healing. It was very important for healing. In a lot of parts of the Pacific, ava was a recreational drink. So everybody drank a lot of ava. And in some places, if you're going to visit a chief, you didn't bring him a pig, or you didn't bring him fish, or you didn't bring him a bundle of cloth, you brought him a bundle of ava. That was the ritual offering whenever you made a visit. That wasn't like that in old Hawaii. It was almost entirely religious ceremonies and healing purposes. Okay? And there were a lot of varieties for those different purposes. But once in a while, there were individuals who, for their own reasons, would get addicted to it. Now, so what happened in Macaulay's case was that the stresses of all his chiefly responsibilities just started to get to him and continued and increased. Partly they did because he got pleasure out of being in control. He got pleasure out of being a chief and being treated like a chief and at least trying to control everything that was happening. Okay? He preferred to do that. He wasn't very good at delegating. That's how his father did it, and many of the chiefs, but he wasn't good at that. And what happened was, like I said, Ava, because he discovered the only time he really felt good, he felt relaxed, he felt pleasure, he felt clear-minded, was right after the religious ceremony where he had to drink 1 or 2 cups of Ava. And so, he began, this was like his only outlet. So like I said, he liked the feeling of power, and he liked the feeling from the Ava, he liked the fact that it was quick, it was easy, didn't take any effort to feel good. So, with the passive consent of his advisors, he began ordering his servants to bring him Ava. And at first it was, a cup or 2 after meal. And then it became a cup or 2 when he first woke up, and before and after the meals. And then as time went along, it became more and more. Sometimes he started drinking Ava rather than having a meal. And so he was really getting into an addiction. By now, when it got that bad, he was earning his name. Because one of the symptoms of too much Ava is that the whites of the eyes turn red. And so you immediately know when someone is doing that. In fact, even today they call that Macaulay, red eye. Okay? But there were other symptoms too, other outward signs as he kept drinking more and more and more of this. His pupils enlarged. There was a yellowing of the skin. His mouth became dry all the time. The skin became dry and scaly. He had a puffy face as it got worse and worse. Visible tremors. Odd body spasms. And finally, there was a yellow discoloration of the hair and the nails. This is getting serious, very serious. Now, inwardly also, he began to have stomach upsets, headaches, dizziness. I mentioned the dry mouth. And of course, as we can see from some of the symptoms, he was having liver damage. Now, this is really excessive use before these things start to happen. Okay? And it was fairly rare, but it happened in this case. Poor Macaulay experienced all of this. There were those who loved him enough to try and help him change his ways. But the young chief had become addicted and refused any help. What had become as a way of relieving stress became a source of stress. Macaulay was addicted to the pleasures of power and sensation, even when most of the pleasure only existed in memory. Now, sadly, this is not a happily ever after story. Macaulay died. He was replaced. He was forgotten without ever having fulfilled his possibilities as a chief. Don't usually tell sad stories like that, but that fits the topic today. Because we don't want to just know about it, we want to know what we can do about it, what can be done about it. So let's talk about how to heal addictions. In order to start that, we have to talk about what it is, what's really going on. Well, I have to give you my definition in that case. What we call an addiction is a form of compulsive, physical, emotional, and or mental behavior, whose purpose is to provide one or more essential pleasures unobtainable by any other means. Now that's really sounds technical, so let's make it more clear. People are addicted to something that makes them feel better than anything else does, and they're afraid of losing or not having that feeling. That's it in a nutshell. I'm going to repeat that. People are addicted to something that makes them feel better than anything else does, and they become afraid of not having that pleasure or not feeling it. The three main factors here are desire and fear and belief. In order for an addiction to develop, there has to be some pleasurable experience that the person wants to repeat. That's one thing. They also have to have a fear of not having that pleasure, that they won't be able to cope, they won't be able to exist, they won't be able to have any happiness or feeling without that. And, this is another important part, there has to be a belief that there's only one way to satisfy it. Okay? So those things have got to be all part of it. Now the second thing to understand is that we people, in general, can become addicted to anything. We usually think of it in terms of drugs. But people have been and are addicted to gambling, to work, believe it or not, to games. We see that a lot in video games. Nothing wrong with video games. They're a tremendous source of learning and education. But if those other factors are there, it can become an addiction. Okay? People can be addicted to music, even to noise. When I say addicted to noise, usually people become addicted to that when it's the only way they can stop thinking about something they don't want to think about. Okay? They can be addicted to television, texting, eating, dieting, exercise, traveling, criticism, almost anything, including other people. There's a lot of that. So the real problem of addiction is not repeating the pleasurable experience. It's the fear-driven focus on only one way of doing that. You can enjoy watching a lot of football games, but it doesn't become an addiction until you get very upset physically, emotionally, and mentally when you can't watch them. Right? You can enjoy being with another person, but it doesn't become an addiction until you get very upset physically, emotionally, and or mentally when you can't be with them. Every form of addiction that you can think of has the same pattern. Now, addiction can be healed only when a person's focus can be shifted to another kind of pleasure that's not attached to fear, or another way to get the same pleasure that's not attached to fear. That's when healing starts. When we talk about pleasure, there's three main kinds of pleasure. When I say pleasure, some people have a little problem with the word, so what I really mean is feeling good. Okay? So I'm going to call it pleasure for the moment. There are three kinds of pleasure that can be addictive. If the fearful focus is present. Now first is the pleasure of sensation. In the story, this was Macaulay's pleasure. The pleasure of feeling relaxed and unstressed. Right? But he became addicted first to the pleasure of that relaxation, then to the promise of it, and then to the memory of it, when it didn't exist anymore, when he had all those terrible symptoms. Nevertheless, this was how he got pleasure once. It must be the way to get it again. Okay? Somebody famous, and people who have been unfamous have also said pretty much the same thing very often. You can't get different results if you keep doing the same thing. That doesn't work. You can't get different results. Right? And yet, this is what happens in addiction. Physical and sexual activity can also become addictive. Now, this pleasure form of addiction is born from excessive stress. And it's the stress that contributes to that narrow focus of how to relieve it. Because we can't think clearly the more stress we're under, for any reason. So the first step in healing is to find some way to experience deep physical relaxation other than the addictive one. And in most cases, all of these things require help from someone else. Not in all cases, but in most of them, it seems. And then once you're in that state of relaxation, it's possible to think of other things to do, other ways to be, other ways to relax. But you can't think that way if you're fully stressed. Okay? It just will bounce right off. It won't take. People become very skilled at acting like they're listening and absorbing and promising to do the right thing, but unless that stress level, that tension level is taken care of, it won't get inside. Another kind of pleasure comes from a feeling of connection with other people. It could be with anything, but we'll consider people that we call love. One symptom of an addiction here is jealousy. Now, I don't mean when jealousy, can be so mild it really isn't a problem. But the greater the fear of loss, the more intense the jealousy. And a variation of, and anyway, it gets worse and worse, and it becomes controlling for fear. And a variation of this, different, it goes the opposite way, is becoming excessively dependent. Where, like the song says, you can't live without them. Okay? And there are still new songs being written with that same codependent, we call them codependent melodies. Okay? The so-called codependent relationship is when two of one type try to live together, or when two of the two different, so one is dependent and one is terribly jealous, when they try to live together. That's called codependent. They just keep feeding each other's addiction to each other. Okay? The fundamental problem behind this kind of addiction is low self-esteem. A person doesn't have enough of a sense of self-worth to try to do something on their own, to be on their own, to leave a bad situation. Most reason they don't want to leave a bad situation, we can say, look what they're doing, why don't you leave? They're scared to death. Because the idea inside is, without that, I got nothing. And something bad is better than having nothing. This came up actually, we were in Mexico recently. And when we got back, one of the visitors, one of the people who was at the place we were at, said they'd been out all day fishing and didn't catch anything. He said, that's why it's called catching, not fishing. And then the Mexican guide said, well, a bad day of fishing is much better than a good day at work. Okay. But this follows along. Some people take that to an extreme. It requires usually a lot of outside help to improve self-esteem. Or some kind of inner transformation. It can happen that way too. A person can suddenly either have an inspiration or hear or see something that switches on a different thought and pull themselves out of it. Okay? There's got to be some interchange even when somebody else is helping. You can't give anybody self-esteem. You can support, and you can build on what little there might be, and that can be built on with reinforcement, but it has to come from inside. Now the third comes, this is the toughest one. The third kind of pleasure comes from feeling effective. As some people call feeling powerful, feeling in charge, feeling in control. But see, it's important here. What's important is the feeling, not being in control. That's an illusion. But feeling in control, that's the power. We call, when a person gets pleasure from an expression of power or effectiveness, whether it's from learning how to tie a knot or something else huge, a new skill of some kind, there's a feeling of pleasure. That's normal. That's natural. It's when you become dependent on it from that source where it is a real problem. The fundamental problem here is low self-confidence. We got to explain something. Addictive anger, addictive criticism, even being abusive or destructive, vandalism, these all produce power hits. False little feelings of effectiveness. Okay? And confidence, some people think, well, you teach a person how to be confident, they'll be okay. Teach them how to play a sport, teach them how to do this or that, and they'll be so confident they'll go out and change their ways. No, it really doesn't work like that, unfortunately. Confidence is very specific. It seems generalized in some people, and that's only because those people have found a lot of things to be confident in. But even they can encounter something that just throws them off. Okay? Confidence is very specific. The more things you can be confident in, the easier it is to generalize it into other similar areas. I helped a person one time from Big Island when I was living on Kauai. And the man was having problems with his family and really didn't know what to do. This wasn't an addiction thing, but the same thing kind of applies. And so after talking to him for a bit, it came out that he was a master mechanic. I mean, real good. And so as I talked to him, I said, well, you know what you could do? I said, you could think of your family as a machine and use your mechanic skills to fix the problem. Now, I didn't tell him specifically what to do because I'm not a master mechanic. But I gave him the idea of applying the skills in one area of life to another area of life. Now, even though this can be done, it isn't automatic with many people. Okay? But once you give them the idea, it can produce wonderful effects. In this particular person's case, 2 weeks later, he called me up and he said, family problems are all solved. I did what you suggested, handled it like a machine, and everything's fine. Now see, here's a master mechanic. And a master mechanic knows you don't try to control a machine. You have to understand it. You have to put grease where grease is needed. You have to make sure the right parts are working together in the right way. You have to help the machine work. And that's what he applied to his family. So yeah, he was able to take confidence in one area, take that skill and apply it to what seemed to be a totally different area. That can be done. And if you can help inspire somebody to do that, then you're going a long way toward helping them. One of the examples I like to use is the fact that most people know how to drive a car. Well, what do you do when you're driving a car? What you're doing when you get to be pretty good at it, okay, is you're making mistakes 99% of the time. Now what? You're going in the wrong direction. What? Sure you are. Because nobody holds the steering wheel steady for the trip. You're constantly making adjustments, right? Constantly. Once in a while, you have maybe 100 feet as you might go without having to move the wheel too much, but most of the time, you're either going too far that way, you're going too far that way, and you have to keep adjusting. So every time you make a mistake, what do? You don't scream and holler and fall down and crash. You make an adjustment. We do that when we're driving. And if you don't drive, works with bicycles too. Okay? But that's a fantastic skill that can be applied to other areas of life too. Once somebody gives you the inspiration, or you give someone else the inspiration. Okay? So we have all kinds of skills in which we are confident that we could apply to something else, but it's rarely automatic. So that's my point here. Okay? With the addictive person, skill training is very useful, like I said, or helping them apply one skill to another area. But all too often, and this is what makes it tough, the power hit, that rush of feeling good, is what's so attractive. It's quick, it's simple, it's easy, it feels good, and nothing else you've experienced so far really fits the bill, really has that same effect in so many cases. That's what makes it hard to change that kind of a pattern. Not impossible, but just want to let you know, it's the confidence. The more confidence a person has, the more willing they are to try different things to accomplish the same thing. The less confident they are deep within themselves, the more difficult it is to change when you found one thing that works, even when it stops working. See, gambling, for instance. There are certain kinds of drugs that produce the same effect, but gambling, for instance, nobody becomes an addict without having won and feeling that tremendous rush of having won. And the person who's basically both low self-esteem and low self-confidence becomes addicted to that rush, which gets reinforced whenever they do win, which generally becomes more and more rare because they get more and more stressed, and you don't win real well when you're too stressed. But they keep trying it because that worked once. Okay? That's the addictive thing. So the keys here in healing addictions are relaxation, self-esteem, self-confidence. Those are the key healing things. Any technique or any kind of intervention, whatever is tried, it's only going to work if it does increase one of those three things or more. Okay? Now, we never know what's going to work because all healing actually has to come from within. And so, just as one final thing, reminder, it's really good not to become addicted to one way of healing. Okay? Some people do that. Okay? You do what works. And sometimes that means doing something very different from what you're doing. Okay? So that's it in general. We could talk about a lot of other things, but do we have any comments or questions on this topic? Yes.
I'd like to understand a little bit of your difference between self-esteem and self-confidence.
Okay. Self-confidence is a belief in your ability to do something. Self-esteem is a belief in your worth to deserve something.
Regardless of your confidence.
Regardless. See? It's amazing with an awful lot of self-esteem, some people can take on things that they've never learned how to do and do it well. Or take on things that they've never learned how to do, make a mess of it and not care. See? So it doesn't stress them out. See? Okay. All right. Yes.
Became addicted to morphine and turned stuff into the program,
Yes.
methadone. And I have been discussing with them my perspective of it not working because supposedly they cut back on it over a period of time, but it seems like a very long period of time before. I don't understand how they can say that actually works.
Well, here's why. You notice I gave you one particular definition, but my definition is not the general definition. It's definitely not the definition in the, let's say, medical community or the psychological community in general. Because the most common idea out there is that there's a substance that the body becomes so used to that it cannot function properly without. And so that if you can either substitute a different substance or gradually wean a person away from the substance which is addictive, okay, then they'll get well. The amazing thing, of course, is that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. They don't like to focus on the times that it doesn't, and yet there's where we need to look for the keys. Right? Because I used to have a hypnotherapy clinic in California, and I helped hundreds of people stop smoking. I didn't help them by helping them stop smoking. I helped them by training them to be non-smokers. But the thing we had to start with was, why? Why do you want to stop? Now, out of these hundreds of people, some of them came in with, of course, the standard thing is to be healthy. Well, folks, healthy is an abstract. Your body doesn't understand what that means. That's an intellectual concept. Okay? And so I never had success with anybody who only wanted to do it to be healthy. They just wouldn't continue. And the program wasn't long. Right? The ones I had the most success for, believe it or not, were the ones who came in and their reason they wanted to stop was so that they would smell better for their friends and lovers. That was the strongest motivation as far as effectiveness went. They wanted a different pleasure that was more important to them than the pleasure they were getting from the smoking. Okay? So motivation is vital as a part of this. The other thing that I worked with very well was to really, in detail, for them, with them, analyze what the pleasure of smoking was. And almost always it came down to relaxation from a stressful situation. So I taught them different ways to relax. And when they could do it differently without all the side effects of smoking, that made it easy to change. And then sometimes they were just so used to it. Things in their environment would trigger them. They'd have a meal, cigarette next. Okay? So we began substituting different things. I began teaching them, what have you got? What is it that makes you want to smoke? There's this urge. Great. Reinterpret the urge as an urge. Every time you feel the urge to smoke, drink a glass of water instead. Because dehydration is another big factor. The body wants water, but it doesn't know how to tell you because it's so used to giving you an urge to do something to relax. So we did all these different kinds of things that worked wonderfully, but not for any abstract reason. That didn't work. But anyway, back out here in the world. The idea is that, okay, they give you methadone, which approximates the feeling of morphine, and people get addicted to methadone. Because it's not the substance. And I have to go back to the smoking. And all the people I worked with, some of them were 30 years at 3 or more packs a day. Okay? No one could afford that today. But anyway, that used to be common. Okay. And never once did we have any symptom whatsoever of so-called nicotine withdrawal. Never once. I started my first programs when I began this was 12 hours. This was really fast at the time. And then the results were so good, we cut it down to 4. And I have to tell you about one woman to tell you what can happen here. It's one woman because it was like an addiction. Couldn't function without it. So I had this one woman, and we talking before we went into the hypnotic state, by the way, is just a state of relaxed focus. That's all it is. There's nothing magical or mysterious about it. So before we did the process, we talked a little bit about, and I asked her some things about her. I don't usually take much history. So she said, well, one of the things she says, and she didn't know whether hypnosis would work because I don't like anybody to tell me what to do. I said, okay, I don't do that. So I just guide you into the state. All right, so we're in the state. And one of the things I was have her imagine that she's talking to the cigarette. And so she's talking to the cigarette. I said, okay, well now why don't you just tell the cigarette time for you to leave, cigarette. And I said, what's happening? And she says, it won't let me. I said, what do you mean? I said, just tell me I can't let it go. I said, oh, you're letting somebody else tell you what to do. She came out of trance. Nobody tells me what to do. And stopped, just like that. Okay? Didn't even take a full session. Okay? When the motivation's strong. Now, this is a complex issue in all the different kinds of things. But what I've been trying to do is get simplified to the essence. If you can work on the basics that I've discussed, you're going to have far more success than if you try to treat it as something outside controlling you. Okay? That's what I wanted to get across. Good. Now I said there was going to be a healing with this, and Stewart has offered to do that for you, so come on up, Stewart.
Aloha, everyone. Aloha. So I invite you to take your piece of nature and look it over and examine it and begin to get to know it as a friend. And so we regard these things as, I think it was mentioned, that we can communicate with them, that they are alive, aware, and responsive. And so allow yourself, if you will, to feel into the essence of this piece of nature that you have in your hand. And as you hold that focus, I invite you to close your eyes and to just think about buffet night at the restaurant of the universe. There are two buffets at the restaurant of the universe: the buffet of misery and the buffet of love and happiness. You probably have dined at the buffet of misery enough to know what is offered there. This afternoon is an opportunity to make a different choice. At the buffet of love and happiness is a vast table of wondrous things to feast on. There are big mounds of light and airy joy, long cakes of deep satisfaction, shimmering bowls of jolliness, steaming tureens of sweet comfort, and great platters of delicate kindnesses. There are fat dumplings of generosity, grand salads of sacred acceptance, frothy fountains of fun, and big ornate bowls overflowing with beauty. There are assorted tartlets of curiosity, wonder, and awe, juicy berries of bliss with cream and sugar, sweet-scented pâtés of compassion and care, savory stews of success and service, and great baskets of benevolence. There are fine noodles of connection, spicy sauces of passion and excitement, rich bars of wisdom and discernment, and long, long kebabs of friendship. There are luscious pastries filled with patience and empathy, great trays of insight and understanding, enormous casks of cool forgiveness, fragrant pies of delight and pleasure, and tubs of laughter and giggles. Enjoy your feast. You can come back for seconds and thirds. You can take some home with you. All you need to do is choose what you want and accept it when it comes. So savor this for a moment. And when you're ready to come back, come on back. And open your eyes. And before you put your piece of nature back in the basket, give it a little bit of yourself with your breath. Mahalo.
Mahalo, right? Very good.